As I said at the top of the show, a new legislative task force has been studying how public schools are funded since late last year with an eye toward overhauling the current system. And joining us today are the two chairs of that committee. We have Representative Craig Horn, as I mentioned at the top, from Union County, and we have Senator Michael Lee from New Hanover County. Now, it is officially called the Joint Legislative Task Force on Education Finance Reform. Your first meeting was November 1st, 2017, and at least according to, I guess, the enabling legislation, you're targeting having recommendations by October of 2018. So I guess we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let me just, here's an easy question to start out with. In a nutshell, what do you think are the problems with North Carolina's existing funding model for public schools? Representative Horn, we'll start with you.
It's very complex, hard to understand. We hear from chief financial officers at the district level. We hear from others that are interested and have supported education in North Carolina how complex our funding formula is. It's a bit of a maze with 30+ silos. It's a full-time job just figuring out how this funding works. Then add to that the fact that we have funding sources from the state, the federal, the local, grant money. There are a lot of things at play. How do you balance all that? That's the question.
Now, Senator Lee, when the commission was first established, I mean, part of the charge, I mean, this was in the legislation, but also in the first meeting, was to move away from the current allotment system. I mean, that was more, and actually to move to a weighted student funding formula. That was actually specific. It was actually the same thing that the Program Evaluation Division was asked to study, just moving to a weighted student funding formula. So, I mean, one of my questions to you and to both of you is, so why are we limiting ourselves as a state to say, well, okay, we're going to move away from this and we're going to go to this model? I mean, there are other models. Is the committee or the task force looking at other models?
So first, we're going from this resource allocation, and as you mentioned, the charge was a weighted student formula for lots of different reasons. One is transparency. It's difficult under the current system to see how the funding actually makes its way to the outcomes that we're looking at and looking for. We did have at least one committee meeting where we had a survey and looked at what other states are doing with regard to weighted student formula and also some other funding mechanisms. However, I think that our charge as a committee is to look at the weighted student formula, so that's the direction we're heading in.
Now, we've got a pretty savvy audience who watches the show, because we've been talking about things like the weighted student funding formula it's basically figuring out what the base number is and then adding on sort of, you know, whether you have special needs children, other factors. Is that, am I correct?
Basically, it's funding our education based on the needs of each and every student. Now, you mentioned children with disabilities, special needs children. There's a wide range of funding models for special needs children. Children with cerebral palsy have a much higher need and therefore much higher cost than do children, let's say, with some speech impediments.
Right.
So are we funding that appropriately? When that particular piece started, an arbitrary 12.5% was set. Based on what? We moved it to 12 3/4. Is that sufficient? Is it too much? It may be too much in some districts. It may not be sufficient at all in others.
Right. This is. I actually was going to get into this in a little bit, but since you brought it up, I want to ask you, Senator Lee. This has been an area that you've been passionate about, talking about how we fund exceptional children. Is this something you think can be addressed? I mean, it's a problem, and you've heard from the districts. You mentioned this, it went from 12.5 to 12.75, but we've got half the schools that are over that cap.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the weighted student formula can address that, and as Representative Horn mentioned, depending on the severity of what the disability is. You know, we can also look at the intersection of other HHS and some other funding sources as we come into the school system, because right now we have duplication in some instances of services that are provided to students through HHS, through Medicaid and other programs, as well as through DPI and the local LEAs.
Well, last question on this, back on the weighted student funding formula. You mentioned the finance officers who've come in and talked to you. From what I've seen, they are overwhelmingly in favor of maintaining position allotments, and that's for principals, for teachers, for nurses, librarians, guidance counselors. And what they tell me and what they've told you is that it allows them to hire the very best candidates available for the positions they need without basically worrying about the budget implications that would then if they have to sort of, if they have a bucket of money and they have to make choices on maybe not hiring the best person. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a much more complex issue than it first appears. They are, by and large, we hear a lot of support for maintaining the position allotment system. We're one of only a few states that actually approach it this way. Why are we one of only a few states that actually approach it this way? We must dig a little deeper. We also need to realize that LEAs use state money to pay their most expensive teachers and use local money to pay their lower salaried teachers. Why is that? Now, is that the right way to approach it? Well, if I'm a chief financial officer, that certainly is the right way I'd approach it, but is that the right way for this state to approach it?
Gotcha.
So we need to learn why we do it the way we do it. Let's unpeel the onion. Let's understand how we got where we are, why we are where we are, and then let's rebuild the onion to meet the needs of the student. So that's what should drive all of our decisions. What are the needs of the student?
Right. Let me shift over to talk a little bit about adequacy of funding. It's been all over the national news. We've got teacher walkouts and protests in West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arizona over school funding. You and I have had conversations about per pupil funding. We're going to have another one. North Carolina ranks 43rd nationally in per pupil spending, 11th in the Southeast, and that's the most recent numbers available. There's a lot of different numbers you can look at, but y'all have said that you don't want to look at adequacy, although you are asking LEAs about how much it costs. So you are looking at adequacy, right?
So, I mean, adequacy is important as we look at the broader context of North Carolina. As you know, one of the weighted formulas might be low wealth funding because there is inadequacy around our state from some of our more rural areas and some of our more metropolitan areas. So certainly we are looking at adequacy as we talk about the broader scope of rural versus urban, and it's something that we need to be looking at in the context of our statewide funding.
Right, and I think that also gets, and I want to get into it in the second part too, the issue of equity. But let me, Representative Horn, but adequacy. I mean, look, you may not like per pupil numbers, but you've got other things we can point to. Declines, 38% decline in textbook funding, 53% decline in supplies and materials. Those are since 2008, 2009. Those are the kind of things that teachers tell us. 7,000 fewer teachers' assistants. I mean, those are the things that when teachers say, you have raised my pay, but there's a lot of other things that
would cost.
Yeah.
Adequacy is critically important, of course, but if you don't have a system for allocating money, a system in which you have faith, which is believable, which is navigable, if you don't have a system for allocating money, you're going to end up with two problems. One is adequacy and the other is waste. So first, what we're trying to do is develop a system that makes good sense for North Carolina. Then we can go back and say, this system, which makes good sense for North Carolina, needs to be more fully funded. And the legislature then has faith and confidence, and I would say the people of North Carolina have more faith and confidence that their money is being used wisely. Right. We're Mr. Everyman. Our job is to say to the taxpayer, here's what you're getting for what you're paying.
Right. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, I want to talk more about that. And then I want to get into the issue that you just raised, Senator Lee, about equity in rural and urban. So after the break, more with our conversation with Michael Lee and Craig Horn.